Welcome to your Progressivism Lecture. In this lecture, I want you to be able to define and describe the progressive reform movement. Progressivism takes place towards the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, and it occurred in response to the effects of industrialization. Progressives were generally middle class, educated, Protestant, Christian, religious, and patriotic. The issues they were addressing were, first of all, health and safety. Examples of health and safety issues were poor machinery. Oftentimes workers would get their arms or other limbs caught in the machines and it would maim them. Or they would breathe in dust and end up dying from lung disease. Another effect was low wages. Children were paid lower than the adults. Another effect was child labor. Children as young as 10 were working in the factories, and if they're working in the factories, then they're not being educated, which has a long-term effect. There were no regulations of industry. Part of the reason for that is because of political corruption and the spoils system or the patronage system. What I mean by the spoils system is that oftentimes the industrialists would bribe the politicians in exchange for not passing laws that were favorable to the workers. Because if they passed laws, then that meant less money for the industrialist. So in response to all of that, there will be a number of reforms. Social reforms, economic reforms, and political reforms. Social reforms included health and safety, child labor, and really anything to do with the protection of women and children. One organization that advocated for the protection of women and children was the Women's Temperance Christian Union, or the WTCU. They considered themselves the home protectors, referred to as an ideology called maternalism. Maternalism was just a justification for women's activism in politics and public life. They argued that women as mothers or potential mothers have special talents and sympathies. They will advocate for organizations such as the Child's Bureau and the National Consumers League, which improved the wages and working conditions. One of the results of progressivism is reform legislation. There was a case called Muller versus Oregon in 1908. This case protected women workers, not men. The focus was protection for women's health and future mothers. By protecting mothers, you protect future children. Muller limited the workday to 10 hours, and it was one of the first laws providing public assistance for single mothers with dependent children. It was the first minimum wage law for women. Let's turn to Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was President McKinley's vice president and took over him after McKinley was assassinated during the Progressive era. Roosevelt was a Republican and later would run as a part of the Progressive Party. He was Harvard educated, from a prominent family. He was an environmentalist, and he promoted economic development in the West. We have many of our national parks out here thanks in part to the efforts of Roosevelt. He promoted irrigation projects for dry lands. He believed in big business, but he believed in punishing those who abused power. Teddy Roosevelt would offer his Square Deal program during his presidency. The Square Deal included conservation, corporations control, and consumer protection. Roosevelt was for the better enforcement of the Sherman Antitrust Act from 1890. The Sherman Antitrust Act forbade any combination in the form of a trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in the restraint of trade, which meant it helped fair competition. Roosevelt was for the better enforcement of the Interstate Commerce Act, which established a commission to investigate and regulate railroad shipping rates in 1887. Other economic reforms included the implementation of the Elkins Act, which prohibited discriminatory railroad rates that favored powerful customers, implemented the Hepburn Act, which enabled interstate commerce to set shipping rates. He also was for a number of social reforms. Reforms such as the insurance laws for workers and families for on-the-job accidents, the mothers and women's pensions, which led to the Aid to Dependent Children, which will be passed later on in the 1900s. So Roosevelt was addressing the needs of both progressives and, to some degree, populists. So next, there is Taft. Taft would become president in 1912. He was the hand-picked successor of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt decided not to run. He's off being a war hero and being involved in his environmental causes. The one progressive issue that happens during Taft's administration is the breaking up of Standard Oil. And this was the result of a U.S. Supreme Court case called Standard Oil New Jersey versus the United States. This had actually been started by Theodore Roosevelt, but Taft gets credit for it because it happens during his administration. Roosevelt will later run against Taft because he doesn't like the job that he's doing. So Roosevelt will run as a progressive / bullnose party candidate. And he will run against President Taft and also against a gentleman by the name of Woodrow Wilson. And he will lose that presidency. Woodrow Wilson will become the next president. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. So unlike Roosevelt and unlike Taft, who were Republicans, he is a Democrat. Wilson believed in free enterprise, in pro-labor, and government intervention. And what I mean by government intervention is a form of government where the government can intervene in businesses or the private lives of its citizens. Prior to this, we had what was called a laissez-faire form of government, which is laissez-faire means hands off, meaning the government does not intervene with private affairs or business interests. But much of these progressive ideas and these progressive legislation and so forth will change all of that. Wilson's program included both economic and social reforms. His program was called the New Freedom, which included a federal income tax. So you have Wilson to thank for paying taxes. You have the Federal Reserve Act, which created 12 district reserve banks. And what the Federal Reserves did was they issued currency, paper money, and set interest rates charged by district reserve banks. And this replaced the main functions of central banks at the time, which was to back up commercial banks in case they couldn't meet their obligations. Wilson also implemented the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act. And what this did was to give a flexible definition of illegal practices. In other words, whether an action or substantially lessened competition to create a monopoly. So they decided in other words, they need to decide whether a company was a monopoly or not, and if they needed to be broken up. This will also include a Federal Trade Commission, which will enforce the Clayton Act, and this gave the power to decide what was fair. In other words, this commission investigated companies and issues order against anti-competitive practices. In other words, if a company was found to be a monopoly, this commission could order them to be broken up. Wilson also had social reforms, such as the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations, which investigated conditions of labor. He also had the Adamson Act, which established an 8-hour workday for railroad workers, the Seamen's Act, which eliminated old age abuses of merchant sailors, and workman's comp for federal employees. So all of this was an expansion of the federal government. Wilson's failures included child labor reforms. He doesn't really get much with respect to child labor reforms. And then, of course, I mentioned before he was not a supporter of African American rights, so he doesn't do a lot for racial prejudice or African American disenfranchisement. He also doesn't do much for the voting rights of immigrants either. So this wraps up your progressivism lecture. As always, let me know if you have any questions.